I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This week on the Poetry of Predicament podcast, we welcome Dr. Gary Belkin and his organization COP Squared, which has done in a very short number of years what many organizations haven't been able to do in decades, and that is to bring public attention and funding and policy shifts to the vitally important issue of mental health concerns with regard to climate change stressors, anxiety, depression, and so on. They have somehow brought the attention of IPCC and global governments and organizations to this vitally important concern. Please welcome Dr. Gary Belkin.
Once you realize how big of an impact climate anxiety has in your daily life, it becomes a heavy burden because as individuals, we're trying to make change in the world. And as young people, it's our futures.
I can't morally justify raising a child in a planet that's literally on fire.
65,000 years of knowing, of belonging, gone because of climate change.
7 years ago, the Lancet said that climate change is the biggest threat to global health of the 21st century. We're not seeing enough investment, commitment, or will to protect our health and the health of the planet.
Is there going to be a natural disaster that devastates my home? Are we going to have food shortages? Will I get left behind? Will my family get left behind?
We need a solution that lives up to that breadth of impact, and that's what we're trying to build.
COP Squared is a growing network of hundreds of organizations from all around the world.
We are launching COP Squared to help convene and coordinate action.
COP Squared is crucial for coming together across the planet to raise our collective voices, to get the resources and the prioritization of mental health as a component of how we address the climate crisis.
With COP Squared, we create a structure that is really dynamic, that's contextually relevant, and that's culturally sensitive as well. And we begin dialogue where we can feed in ideas and opinions from people from every part of the world.
The organizations joining the initiative so far have really reflected the diversity and spread of efforts across the global north and south to connect psychological resilience with climate resilience.
Climate change demands so much psychologically to go through, and so the collective glue for contending and coping with all that is what we have to put in place. The COP Squared with the Race to Resilience has opened up the chance and the responsibility to show what that looks like at great scale.
We need psychological resilience to be persistent and to advocate for climate action. And we need to protect each other as well, because we understand how challenging it is and how difficult.
That's what, also fosters emotional resilience for people and communities. And I think that's what I would really need at the moment, honestly. Yeah, that's what I would need.
COP Squared is what we need now. These are the kind of conversations we need to be having, and this is how change happens.
People and planet
are indivisible.
And it's time to dress both
Together.
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 Well, Dr. Gary Belkin, welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast.
It's an honor to be here.
It's great to have you. We've been talking about getting together now for a few weeks, and I've really been looking forward to it. And so I'm glad we're starting out 2023 having this conversation. So we've just watched a brief video that you have that shows people like myself who don't know much or anything about your programs, what you're up to, and it's very moving. I'm a sucker for a well-produced video, and that's just beautiful. But what really brought me in was there's something very, very compelling for me personally, given my interest in kind of the human dimensions of human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems, of which climate change is a part. I've always been drawn to what are our human reactions, what matters most to the person I'm listening to or watching, and how do they evoke from me what matters most. And it's hard to find something that is as shared and as deep as our mental and emotional and psychological well-being. So it's really impressive that's what apparently you're up to in a number of different ways, not to mention the core of your professional career. So I'm hoping, would you mind starting out by just introducing yourself, giving us a little sense of who you are, and then who you are into these relatively new programs that you're a part of birthing. So again, welcome. Really good to have you here.
Sure. And thank you so much again for the invitation. So I'm Gary Belkin. I'm a psychiatrist, and I always wonder why I lead with that. It's just this cultural convention of leading with one's professional or educational training. And I'm very glad that I'm a psychiatrist, but I unlearned most of my psychiatry and found better uses for it by doing lots of other things than the typical sort of clinical care work, especially working in the Global South. I had the opportunity to work with efforts like the Millennium Villages Project in Sub-Saharan Africa with health nonprofits like Partners in Health and their teams who were looking at health very differently in terms of how to do it by really imparting skills and investing in the local wisdom of places to both inform and do much of the work of healthcare and promotion. And I thought, and others were thinking at the time, gee, we should do mental health that way, even more so. That it is evolved, certainly in the Western model, as a hoarding of knowledge in the hands of very few skilled people, designated skilled people, rather than distributing knowledge so people can be supportive to each other and really put into the fabric of social networks and connections to do the work of mental health care and promotion. And so I got a taste of how to do it that way. And at the time, there was also growing this field that became the field of global mental health, which really added a huge evidence base that showed there are tons of skills that could be what's often called task shared, not just among certain professionals, but across community members. And so there's really now a good science about what those skills are, and there's a ton of them, from the whole care to mental health promotion and resilience building and spectrum. And they can be done by all sorts of people. What's really interesting to me about all that is it opens up a whole new, unique and powerful and more impactful, I think, role for mental health professionals, more conventional mental health licensed professionals, particularly in the Western model, to be partners to community members, to use, adopt, be coached in, and be supported and backed up by those professionals for community members to take those roles. So that's sort of, I came out of that in and brought that to roles that I was having, less as a clinician, individual clinician, than a more of a public health policy kind of person, until recently I was the deputy health commissioner here in New York City, and put a lot of those principles to work. And we invested in showing that they are not only fit in the cultures and resource situations of the global South, but are actually a former mental health director of WHO, Shekhar Saxena, has often said, in terms of mental health, every country is a developing country. And the global North also just has an impoverished, narrow, flat, and not terribly effective model of trying to take care of people's mental health, that this kind of task shared approach is also a real refreshing antidote to.
Can I just ask you for a few moments of translating your words, which are very, very clear at an organizational and obviously a medical professional level, how that shows up for me as someone who's not at that level of the conversation, is that it's appeared to me since I was able to understand about mental health. I grew up in California, and in my youth, the mental health services in the state were decimated by the then Governor Ronald Reagan, just literally decimated the entire mental health services community. And what then surfaced was an extraordinary explosion of homeless population that has never slowed down. So that's one piece where this kind of policy, creation of policy, be it literally at any level, state, national, these are the huge levels. Another level that has been very active for me since getting actively into the field of from a lay perspective, supporting and resourcing people who self-select as being aware of human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems, part of which is climate change, and that whole conversation that we just heard some lovely testimony about. One piece that's been very present for me, as I mentioned, from as soon as I could know what mental health services were, was that it seemed like there was precious little support for anyone below a certain socioeconomic status. So there was just no way for them to get mental health services, or else and on top of that was often a stigma that it was somehow a weakness or something that one would never want to be seen needing mental health help. So we've got quite a few chunks of really adversarial elements to have mental health be functional in the USA in particular. So I'm wanting to just mention these things and kind of run them by you. Are these representative of some of the policy shifts and the framing shifts that you're talking about wanting to do? And one last thing I'd like to just confirm with you that I'm hearing you right is when you're talking about gosh, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the exact word you used, but it's like the idea of partnerships with other levels of service providers that aren't necessarily doctors, they aren't necessarily therapists, they aren't necessarily mental health professionals in the traditional sense. And what I think I'm hearing you say is that there's a way to expand out that repertoire, that teamness that could be created, that it sounds like it almost could exponentially increase access to and reduce the stigma of mental health services. Could you respond to any of those pieces that sparked for you?
Sure, they're all connected, and then I want to bring them back to where you started and where I was going, and which is why that's this more nimble and participatory and more widely scoped way of what to expect from our mental health system is especially urgent in the face of environmental collapse. So I want to end there, but to start with where you just landed is yes, it's the community is the team. It's mental health as a community project, not as a mental health clinic project, but for which the mental health clinic or providers, licensed provider's office has a role to play, but is not the center of gravity. And so, and this isn't an ideology. This is just it works better to see community members as healers and to equip them and support them to be good ones, but also to connect them to more formalized systems as backup when needed, and as coaches as needed. And so it's that sort of approach that I have learned a lot seeing others do it elsewhere, and also helping engineer how to do it, and then got to do that full bore here in New York City. Where we had, to make this a little more tangible, we had, daycare center staff who were able to screen for maternal depression and do some basic exploration of that with new moms. And we focused on daycare centers that were seeing, that were in and seeing high diversity neighborhoods and mothers. We would train moms in public housing to do evidence-based pro-attachment parent coaching to peer moms. And I can go on and on. Those sorts of, someone asked me, how are you going to, what would you want the legacy of this work to be? And I said, it's that you don't have to look for care, you trip over it. And so this is the way to engineer it in a way that really treats community members as the front liners for mental health. And when I say mental health, I mean the whole gamut. Care for very psychotic people, which I'll get to in a minute, which is where public policy mostly focuses on in a fragmenting and narrow way. And I think a very hugely stigmatizing way, which is sort of the California crisis that you describe and the crisis that we seem perpetually in. But the whole gamut from that to more common, but still very debilitating, depression, anxiety situations, and the work of prevention and promotion and resilience building, which our system divides into silos because that divides professional interests. I mean, there's nothing about the work that makes them more smartly divided up like that. It's really about clinician, what different professionals are interested in doing and get paid to do. So we need a system that can break down those practice silos by reimagining the field of play as the community and not the clinic, which gives the clinic actually a much more transformational role. And when we did this in New York City, so I remember site visiting a program for drop-in youth, runaway youth and disconnected youth, who were training staff to counsel them. The staff were 20-year-olds. The clients were 15-year-olds. And so I sat with a staff and a client and this psychiatrist who was the partner. We grant seeded these partnerships between community-based organizations and behavioral health providers. So the psychiatrist was like the coach backup. And I remember her saying to me, if you thought that I would ever agree to supervise a non-clinician, this 20-year-old who is going to of how to take care of someone else, the 15-year-old that I would never see, I would say you were crazy. But she says, this is the most rewarding work I've ever done. My skills reach more people, reach people who the system never reaches and who would never come to. And so you have 15-year-olds saying, if it wasn't for Jose, his 20-year-old peer counselor, I wouldn't have told anyone that I was suicidal. And so it deals with the realities that people, that mental health care, emotional care doesn't just need some level of technical knowledge. It needs some context of credibility, safety, tacit knowledge, and so forth to work. And so we've got to build it that way. Now, why is that relevant to, and just to make the point that the mental health system, one of its horrific silos is this distinction between what is often referred to as the seriously mentally ill, or SMI, and everything else. So depressed moms or anxious kids or middle-aged crisis, suicidal men, or all that stuff is over there. The real problem, right, are the homeless guy screaming on the street. And in some ways, yes, those spectrum of people need different things, but they need far more similar things than they need different things. And by parsing out the SMI folks, which is really about an implicit implication, an implicit perception that this is a more biological problem that needs therefore more strong interventions, right? Like more powerful medicines and more constrained environments and lack consent because they're all those assumptions. One leaves policy with a very short list of menus that mostly have underperformed, and ignores this whole other menu of stuff of supportive, social-based care kinds of approaches that we think are okay for everyone else, but are fall down the totem pole of investment because they're not about the real problem, right? The hardcore problem. So everything that I mentioned, all these things that we did in job training programs and school classrooms, and we did something called friendship benches, where we set up stuff in neighborhoods with peer counselors who just talk to passerbys. All that kind of, and these early attachment things, early psychological resilience building kind of approaches, that whole array of stuff in a whole array of places. All of that got undermined because this politics of the serious mentally ill kicked in. People started criticizing the mayor at the time. Why are you investing in this fluffy stuff when there's real problems? The guy screaming on the street. Mm-hmm. And so we keep playing that political game of there's some zero-sum contest between one kind of suffering and another, rather than we need an infrastructure that's more social and community capacity driven, which will help everybody. Because frankly, the menu for the SMI of hospitalization and forced outpatient medication has vastly underperformed and is embarrassingly inadequate without this larger contextual approach. So we should start with the contextual approach and then fill in where deeper needs are needed. Now, this was my world. This is the kind of stuff that I was trying to build out, which connects mental health much more closely to the social context and the social determinants of distress and trauma and so forth, and engages in that conversation. It makes it hard to push outside, keep outside the walls of the clinic, because you're doing it on the street, literally. And so it actually reshapes the work in hugely wonderful ways that I can get into. But that approach, as I was personally feeling like this is all great work, but I'm wasting my time if I'm not doing stuff about climate change and the conditions that we are going to have to face individually and collectively. The social ties, the collective efficacy, the social fabric we're going to need to not kill each other or numb ourselves enough that we, by default, punish ourselves in the face of environmental collapse. And so I felt like, what can I do other than get arrested, which I did, to bring to this table? And I thought, it's this stuff. It's this kind of way of thinking about mental health as not a treatment system, but as a resource growing system, that psychological resources are like water for communities to cope, act, endure, problem solve, remain joyous together while demands only grow.
Right.
Kind of essential air. And the only way that air is going to get, everywhere is by these kinds of community models. So that for me was kind of the connection of operationalizing what people were talking about, mental health impacts, emotional resilience, all this stuff, inner development, everything that was, and that still is in the air. I felt, okay, here's at least one path to put operational meat on the bones of that. How do we actually put that in the hands of community members? How do we actually grow it? How do we actually have it, be in the stew of communities trying to find their way through these times?
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering if you could say, well, that the film that we started out with is on a website which calls itself COP2, and I'm wondering if you could tell us, what does that name mean? What is that program about? And also any other programs, because I know you have your fingers in quite a few different mental health, communities. I'm wondering if you could really spell out for us, how does that show up with programmatically? You've got this, this is the only one that I'm really familiar with. And so I'm wondering if you could let us know, how does this COP2 fill the bill in any way with the issues that you're talking about?
So it's COP squared.
COP squared, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, which is important in terms of why we called it that. So I'd been working since I left that public health sort of career and role to really focus on this preparing communities to face to have this psychological resilience element in their toolkit as communities who are facing environmental change, transitions, etc., and damage, and trauma. I've, for example, brought a group of leaderships from the U.S. National Professional Mental Health organizations, the American Psychiatric Association, Psychological Associations, those groups, to try, we call it the social climate leadership group. We also have to care about the social climate if we're going to have a chance at tackling and being good stewards of the Earth's climate. And so we started trying to socialize this idea. Mental health professionals have this new opportunity to really help their communities and partner with them in different ways. And so those conversations were going on, and those have progressed, and there's actually, I think, a much more greater audience and receptivity to those ideas in congressional offices and levels of federal government than there were 2 years ago, and I can get into that. But those conversations were happening, and then we were realizing that there were other organizations and groups globally that were having similar conversations. In that they were thinking about mental health, again, in this instrumental way, that it wasn't just an end in itself. How do we do a program that reduces depression? It was looking at mental health as a means to an end, that it was again, this psychological resource, that it was really an instrumental value, and it should be engineered so it really maximizes that value. How does it help communities stay together? How does it help people, kids staying in school? How does it help, these other social outcomes, including ones essential to collective efficacy in the face of climate change? So, and these groups, as that were thinking about mental health in this way, were coming at it from all different directions. There were mental health professionals, which is where I had sort of started, mental health systems and people who've been doing community mental health work for a long time. But there were youth organizations, youth climate activists who are saying, there's also this huge, mental health emotional issue and trauma issue. People working sustainable development and sustainability advocacy. Organizing our community around this and the changes and shifts and transitions is very disorienting and dislocating. How do we give them the mental architecture to cope and deal with this, and what are tools and methods we can use to do that? And so the researchers who are coming at it from all different directions, the usual psychology, mental health sort of focus, but people coming from how do we design cities, in the Anthropocene? How do we mainstream policy around well-being? We're all coming at this nexus of mental health writ large, and the demands of a crushing, suffocating environment, but coming at from different directions. And so we said, okay, this is a big, capacious topic. It's now global north-south. From our own little, who knew, got a list of like 50 organizations. And so we started having phone calls. And that then led to forming this group called COP Squared, which is now, as I last was counting our roster, close to 400 organizations that have signed up. And this is in 5 to 6 months.
Wow.
And they come at it from all over globally and from all over in terms of activity, discipline, et cetera. And so the idea was there should be a place, like a meeting room, that brings these different strands together for knowledge sharing, but also for best practice consensus. All the ways we're coming at this, from starting from a place of indigenous and cultural knowledge traditions as being better used for these emotional resilience, collective strength purposes, or we were getting this variety. Okay, how do we pull those together to tell national leaders, government leaders, here are the 5 things you should do to grow this kind of local strength building. And so that's what COP Squared was originally sort of thought to be add value to. It's great to have everyone know each other, and there's a community of interest that's big, and share what they're doing. But it's also really, okay, let's really take advantage of these multiple perspectives and this this hands-on work that comes at all these facets to get to tell folks, okay, how do we grow more of it?
Yeah, I have a couple of just kind of idiosyncratic questions, little pieces of curiosity that I carry with me, unfortunately now for years. One of them is just a quick question of, amongst those 400 organizations, I'm assuming that you've got some representation from the Climate Psychology or Climate Psychiatric Alliance from either North America or UK or both. Does that ring a bell?
Oh, absolutely.
Great. I kind of assumed, but I just thought I would ask. And then really, I think the far more pressing question for me, and I don't know if this might be an entirely different call that we might have somewhere in the future. My experience is in talking with people from the Climate Psychology Alliance and so on for years now, And in addition to mental health professionals, before there was a Climate Psychology Alliance, where I was really seeking out where are the mental health resources and support systems that I can refer my clientele to, people who are coming out of my coursework and this body of work at its level. And the issue that I kept being confronted by, and really, if I may, just angered by, is the anecdotal reports from mental health professionals, let's say from somebody from Florida or somebody from New York or whoever I'm speaking with. And I'd ask them, just out of curiosity, how many of your associates, how many mental health professionals at your level are even engaged with in any kind of significant way with the climate issue or with the environmental concerns and so on that are going on. And in other words, believe it, how many believe it? As I know that that's a rustic and corrosive language, that it does not reflect the real situation, but that still, 5, 7, 10 years ago, and even to now, I think there's still a ridiculously large population of mental health professionals who have absolutely no monitoring whatsoever, no criteria, no filtering for how will you address, given your own framing of what's going on in this rather large issue, how will you be of service to an 18-year-old activist that comes in who's desperately anxious when she's not depressed? And so I hope that wasn't too cloudy a question. It's been so frustrating for me to know that the mental health community at large, therapists is who I usually talk with, so that's mostly what I'm talking about. And I just find it downright insulting if someone considers themselves capable of taking on that kind of clientele if they themselves aren't engaged in a very real way with the issues. Does that ring a bell? And do you have anything to say about that?
Oh, absolutely. And it sort of shows the alternative trajectory that COP Squared is going on, and how to use clinician knowledge, and how to use indigenous knowledge, and how to use youth knowledge, and how to use, there are climate organizations that have found their own way, have crafted their own menu of psychological skill building to use for support groups and self-care. The Good Grief Network, I think, is just a great example of really a rigorous and thoughtful way that people can just, support each other in a way that is not just, okay, I have someone to lean on, but I can actually grow through this. I can actually also transform through this, right? Mm-hmm. So that borrows from mainstream psychology and so forth, I think, in very smart ways. Mm-hmm. But it's also because of the problem that it's focused on and the purpose that it's put to, actually creatively innovates. Mm-hmm. And so that's the energy and that we want to capture. And so what we thought we would do is try to capture it and then yell at people, here's what the people who are capturing that feel they need to grow it to scale. So it's not mm-hmm. just boutique-ish. And so COP Squared started out that way. And along the way, we held over the last fall what we called regional dialogues. So we have global regions with organizations that kind of stepped up to be leads and so forth. And we thought we'd generate some consensus ideas, and someone would go to COP27, because that was the first kind of event point on the time horizon that this all grew, and go in a street corner and yell at somebody. But we, along the way, we got much more traction than we expected in such a short time in engaging with the High-Level Champions Office, who were overseeing and launching the Race to Resilience, which, if you're not familiar with, is the High-Level Champions Office and the whole UN climate infrastructure is really to mobilize civil society. The COP meetings bring negotiators, national governments together, because that's a condition of the UNFCCC treaty, right? The convening of parties, COP. But 20, 30,000 other people show up. Industry, advocates, activists, scientists, local and regional governments. And so what the high-level champions office through the Paris Accords was empowered to do and created to do was to mobilize all of them to get stuff done. And so one thing they did was the Race to Zero, which was about pledging for emissions reductions. And then they later launched and gave more emphasis to it, the last COP, COP27, last November, is the Race to Resilience. Okay, how do we accelerate adaptation work locally, particularly in the highest impacted parts of the world where 4 billion people live by 2030? And that was mostly infrastructure, and they're amassing a huge effort of local infrastructure work, securing and hardening food systems and other utility systems and water systems and so forth. So it's physical infrastructure. And so we made the argument, well, you need resilient people for resilient places, and you should have a people's resilience, aka mental health, aka psychological resilience, capability that you're also building to reach 4 billion by 2030. And so they agreed to that. And so COP Squared first win was to collaborate with them to write kind of a playbook, a roadmap of how their partners in the Race to Resilience could also adopt and include skill building, toolkit distribution for local communities to do emotional resilience work across the spectrum. And so what's amazing about that opportunity is it's a set table. It brings already mobilized communities with partners working on problems that they are identifying and prioritizing, and adding this element. And the key thing here that the mental health system has never been designed to do, as I said a little bit before, is see their work as helping people do other things. And so that's when it works. That's when it clicks. That's when it is designed smartly. That's when it knows if it's on course, is if whether it's counseling for depression or helping traumatized moms be better early infant bonding parents, it is if it has this other objective, then it's really, there's a thirst for it, there's a clarity to when it's working, how it's working, and then there's a real partnership in doing the work. And so what we hope to show is that adaptation, climate adaptation, is very much a psychosocial activity. I mean, adaptation is a psychological term, right? Resilience arts is a psychological term. And so we've got to be psychologically smart and how we help people be psychologically equipped,
right,
to do the work of physical adaptation and resilience. And mental health systems have to see that their value to humanity is helping those people do that. And then everything else falls into place.
Can we just take a moment or two to throw some terms out so that people could know what's going into this toolkit that you're talking about, these effective organizations at whatever level that they're offering out, so that they are something that the public wants. They get it. They say, oh yeah, I got that going on, and you've got these things to support. Yeah, let me in. Let me do that. I can tell you just about some of the very rustic, my own tiny little, layperson levels offering support and resources to the specialized community that I address. I start out with a first aid level resilience skills, and that's basic self-regulation and co-regulation. And I know these terms, every one of them you're going to know in spades, but I'm saying them so that anybody who doesn't know what you're talking about in that toolkit, why would people want to engage with it? How do you let them know about the tools, and how do you speak it in such a way that they can relate and desire to engage? straight away. So anyway, at the first aid level of resilience, that's the disaster relief. For a lot of people, that's what it takes to start to be aware of these climate issues and so on. And so, at that level, it's literally just, can we bring people back to being present in their body as they're sleeping with 50 other families in the high school gym because the hurricane has just devastated their community? So that level of skill set is pretty basic, pretty easy to learn. I learned as a facilitator for Elaine Miller Karras's community resilience model. I don't know if that's familiar to you, but that's when I was first writing my book, The Impossible Conversation, I was looking for who's teaching skills, who's offering resources, inner and outer resources that people can really put to use, especially when it's at that really disaster relief level. So I imagine there's some kind of basic or first aid level resilience skills, as I might call them. And then there's a next level up if people can have some normalcy in their life to be able to engage with a bit more significant practices. There's this whole practices of reconnection level that I offer, and those really are like a menu because yours will be different than mine. But the good news is that we could have 10 of us sitting in the support group every Thursday night, and we can support each other even though we have different practices we're taking on. So let me just stop there. I wanted to give you just a little sense of the kind of stuff I do and the kind of words I use to describe it. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what some of these offerings are you're talking about and the words you use to describe them.
No, so I refer to sort of the spectrum, acute symptomatic distress, even at a psychotic level, traumatic intrusive symptoms to management and care, to rehearsal of strength-based skills and capabilities, and in collective solidarity with others. And so there's a whole spectrum of that, and they come from, and the specific contents and methods, right, and activities that fill in that range come from a lot of things that came out of clinical psychology, a lot of the mindfulness sort of space, and self-care, from indigenous and other cultural traditions, from the global mental health world, which is sort of where I, transformed as a psychiatrist, that take illness categories and really break them down very differently in ways that respond to local understandings of what this distress is, so that it's not importing a pathological definition, but it's listening to a local pathological experience. And so various ways of counseling and supporting people in a symptom-based way, but a very culturally validated symptom-based way. So there's a whole range of stuff. The good news is there's no shortage of a menu. There's also no shortage, and again, I know it best from in the work in the global mental health world, of how to implement in a way that basically allows templates, a kind of process of work where localities can go through a process of identifying their own theory of change and set of needs, and map it against a larger menu of things that have sort of worked and customize them for use. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of iterative loop circle can be done at scale, because it has been done at scale to do a lot of the work in the global south that I opened with and described. What we need to do is make that menu very user-friendly to browse. And so part of the work of this roadmap is to lay that out. So I'm not going to lay it out at my desk. What we're doing is, for example, we're setting up subject matter focus teams which one is actually to write a broader theory of change for this whole premise that psychological resilience building supports communities to do adaptation work. Okay, so there are lots of reasons to believe that's true, but what are the actual dots that we are assuming and intending to connect in this work over the next 7 years with these actual communities that we're asking to, do psychological strength building, and then how do we expect that to help them adapt to the conditions that they're frontlining around environmental change? So one theory of change. So I'm just learning about just a wonderful, inventive community out there, from grassroots folks to big academic centers who've thought about this from all sorts of directions and traditions and disciplines, so forth. So we're trying to bring them together, and UN agencies who've been thinking about this, and so forth. There's an other focus team on, okay, what are the skill packages that will enable these communities we're going to be going to traverse that theory of change, right? And so that gets into this menu building. And so I'm really trying to get this whole representation, from people working on the inner development goals and mindfulness to people who are much more, repackaging clinical work, to those who came from climate activism and kind of found their own menus and just that whole array. Okay, because there's huge overlap. What do we think are the real kernels here? That is the starter kit and so forth. So I have confidence that there's stuff out there. It's about, and these are really the premises of COP squared. How do we harness, but concisely condense in a good enough way so this becomes operationalizable at scale? And that's really the gap we have to jump. Is it's all now very boutique-ish and often I think global north and south divided, and emitter and environmentally oppressed parts of the world divided in terms of what those psychological needs and tools are, also overlap, but also differences.
Great. Dr. Gary Belkin, it's just been really great to to speak with you. I don't get many positive voices, people who are so obviously committed and effective, evidently, at rallying at scale around any issue these days, but particularly one that has been so desperately crying out and just promises to be a louder and louder scream. I just appreciate.
If I could just say, I appreciate that, but I do want to, going back to the video that we started. I mean, I may be a persuasive guy, but that video reflects a set of work in an organizing network that was barely, 4 months old when we started, working on that video. And the only way that happens, because you saw global youth leadership representation.
Yes.
You saw COP leadership. I mean, the youth envoy for COP 27. We had been collaborating with, Nigel Topping, a high-level champion, and we couldn't get his quote in time for this. But you don't get that kind of ensemble of interest, let alone this path to potentially really impactful collaborative work within this waste to resilience as just a first step. We want to reach other global forums and ways to have impact. You don't have that happen just because one guy, this was really, I think there's really a moment of realization at so many levels that, yes, there's floods and storms and heat, but if we don't invest in people, and that's the P in COP square, right? We wanted to seize the meaning of COP to really reinsert people, and that's why I was correcting you on the squared. It's really adding to the people, care of people times planet, and really thinking seriously, not just talking about it and lamenting it, that this is really traumatizing people, or this really needs people's strengths and so forth, is to, okay, let's diagram that out. What are those, and how do we invest in that resilience, in that infrastructure building, and that what we've been calling the social climate. Let's just not lament its loss. We had 30 years of coming up with Earth climate science, right? Hybridizing disciplines, coming around a shared paradigm to explain the Earth climate. We've got to do the same for the social climate, and we've got to, except we don't have 30 years. And so I feel that coming together, the cogency, the path we have now, the interest that video reflects, and the village that it takes to do it, and that it reflects as reflecting that this issue is tangible in a sense that it wasn't even a couple of years ago. I think COVID sadly had a lot to do with that. But we need the slowest to come. Community leaders get this, partners in racial resilience of all sorts get this. The mental health establishment has yet to get this, has yet to reimagine itself as such an asset to humanity at this point, when it is dragging in purpose and connection and ties and in wherewithal. And it's got to step up and realize what it has to add.
Got it. Yeah, your focus and your passion are refreshingly obvious, and I so thank you for taking this time to speak with me and us. And I just have a couple of requests before I let you go. If you could send me perhaps an email full of whatever links and points of contact that people might be able to use to get a hold of COP Squared, any other programs with which you are involved, and particularly any other agencies that you're aware of that a person could find out what are some of the resources that are available, either at a national or a state or a regional level, any level that you're aware of, that you could point me toward, reference materials. What's the word I'm looking for? Like a directory, if there is such a thing. I'd be happy to include any links that you could supply for us. And just really thank you for the extraordinary, and I would imagine, at least at this point, thankless work that you and so many others are doing to bring this vitally important topic to really front and center on our screen, at least for today.
Well, thanks so much. And it's, being able to, action is, I think, the best antidote to distress. And so I also benefit. I mean, I guess energized so that I'm not mostly grieving. People ask me, so how is it working on climate change all the time? I said, it's just a mixture of kind of interminable grief, but I'm energized, to live with it. And it's finding that others are, and that there are ways to grow energization is something we really have to not give up on, or we can pass all the policies we want to try to shift energy sources and so forth. But if we're not worrying about the social climate, we're really going to stay stuck.
True that. Again, Gary Belkin, Dr. Gary Belkin, thank you so much for taking this time. And I look forward to hopefully spending some more time with you. Perhaps later in the year we could reconnect and take this conversation to the next level, get some updates from you.
Fantastic. And great to spend this time with you. I appreciate it. All right. Take care.
Thank you for joining us in another episode of The Poetry of Predicament. This podcast is produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance. Living Resilience exists to offer transformative support and resources to the collapse-aware and collapse-acceptant communities around the world. Our sole purpose is to curate and offer coaching, support groups, courses, and events that assist people in expanding their core skills, competencies, and capacities for facing a troubled, predicament-laden, yet still ineffably miraculous world.